maybe these videos would be better presented in natural light. So I've extinguished the kitchen light in the background. And the nice thing about this place is that it has natural light on, I guess, almost all four sides. Because if you look, where is it? Oh, I don't know. No, well, this is the front, so you have natural light coming in. There are the blinds, and then the bedroom right there also has natural light. But if you were to look over the refrigerator, then you see there's also a window in the kitchen, but even anyway, deeper down the hallway, there's the back side of the building and light coming in from there. But more importantly, there's a big skylight. So this is pretty impressive indoor architecture, if I may say so myself. There's also a skylight in one of the bathrooms, so that during the day I don't really need to use the electrical lights in here. The light's just coming, I guess, from the computer, from the phone, these devices. And the main thing is just to position yourself in a place where there isn't too much glare. I think I found that right here. And people say, well, you could have a separate office that's away from your living room or your kitchen, but I like to be in the center of things. If I want a coffee or a water, it's right here. And I can enjoy the artworks on the wall. Some of them are paintings, some of them are IKEA. That's a painting. That's IKEA. I think, right? That's, of course, IKEA. Not the original, unfortunately. But anyway, we're in this space, and who cares? Well, less pressure to be nomadic, and also less pressure to fire. What's that? Financial independence, retire early. Because if you like the place where you are, you feel a bit less pressure to assemble a portfolio and thence an income that would be suitable to living in a less expensive region of your country or another country altogether. That's kind of a conflict because, as I said, philosophy tends to require otium. So if you love that, then love it. If you love it, then it's your priority. And you realize, okay, this is my priority. This secondary thing is not. And of my top 3 loves, for number 1, I might have to sacrifice 2 and 3, which is incredibly painful. But which is more painful? Failing to achieve your primary desire? I guess for Aeneas in the Aeneid, that was that duty to found Rome. So whatever founding Rome is for you, you might have to leave Carthage and Queen Dido to achieve that. That's cruel. Drinking a coffee today rather than an espresso. Again, I had this mug from my trusted interior wholesaler, IKEA. IKEA, which do you prefer? The coffee tends to warm me up more slowly. The espresso, obviously, is more of a shot. Sometimes it doesn't agree with an empty stomach. And of course, I prefer to have the caffeine on an empty stomach and just cruise through these notes, language learning or whatever, for the first few hours of the morning. And of course, typically employment, well, it provides money for our future otium, because we always just promise ourselves this future leisure. Otium, I believe, means leisure in Latin, and I'm not just saying that because Latin is important. Latin is good. Okay, great. So is wearing wooden shoes. But Nietzsche preferred to use that term in this situation for some reason. So I'm vaguely remembering various passages of the literature in which that noun stood out. And just anyway, so the poet would collage method anyway address the problem of the poet, or even the poetic philosopher, maybe excessively continental, excessively mythical, had of starting a composition. And this could be your problem if you adopt that persona. Your philosophical persona isn't necessarily the person you are in your daily life. Maybe it has to be suppressed. You can say, oh, well, that's kind of like the superheroes with Kent Clark is really Superman. Sorry, which is the real one, which is the mask? You know, isn't he more real than he is when he puts on the mask? Or Batman as well, Bruce Wayne. Howsoever you have it. I've experimented a little bit anyway with Claude and ChatGPT, and I have to wonder whether the presence of an artificial kibitzer to kind of get you started in private largely solves the problem of writer's block, because of course you can just start writing, and I think no matter how bad it is, or you could even talk about writing itself, you can talk about the inability to start. You can start by talking about the inability to start, and somehow ignite the engine, lubricate it, or whatever. Not sure what the right metaphor is. Right metaphor, not an oxymoron, because one's figurative, visual. The other is a legal term about correspondence or compliance with law. Could mean correct. But yeah, so I just wonder if the whole idea of we're talking about collage method, we're talking about two-column composition method. I wonder if it's best to just start out with a GPT, a chatbot, give it a system prompt to, of course, respond briefly and to the point, not to flatter your ideas, but to give you some information that you're probably missing. And you could command it to assist with accessibility. For example, also help me say things at a 5th grade reading level, even if it's unguarded continental philosophy. Just spewing out there. You know, what's continental? I don't know. Maybe Heidegger, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer. But Schopenhauer is very systematic. So would the real way, the fastest, most efficient, best way to start a book, to make it a GPT session with limited input, so it's not so much a duet, but more so the machine assisting the human. Would that be a good way to start a book? And then maybe in the end you could take away some of that scaffolding. But I always question with this kind of architecture whether the scaffolding is an ugly auxiliary thing that needs to be, set aside, kind of like the cocoon for the butterfly. Maybe we value both. Maybe we alter our sense of aesthetics because that context that's keeping track of your definitions, making sure that the words you're saying, the nouns, are actually consistently defined. If you want to say something else, you use another word. I think language used that way, if it's boring or painful, ultimately going to produce more useful thoughts for yourself or any mind that actually reads the literature and tries to reform itself into new mind by, rewriting its prejudgments, which are just like these more prominently visible tables of relative weights of interrogative categories and whatever, but also relative weights of numerical categories, oneness versus pairs, unity versus relations, and so I did want to mention that. I did talk about the difference between espresso and coffee, different effects on the mind. Maybe someone could say, well, that's fine, but we should get into psychedelics as well. But I don't think that's a very good idea given the possibility of paranoia, fear, because when you want to travel, for example, or make a big investment, do anything that involves risk, I believe that the prior experimentation with psychedelics might excessively strengthen the demons that compel you to remain in your comfort zone. Something to consider. Now, this video, no self-commentary, but I did want to mention I have this map of terms to interrogative categories. I'll give you an example. So the interrogative category is not so much a category as a sentence, like Jim Holt asked, why does the universe exist? Pretty loaded question, but you could say that sentence, oh, that's a why question, because he's asking why. However, if you look at the terminology employed, the ideas, nouns, ideas, John Locke, English philosopher, foundational, coins this concept of ideas, which I guess are nouns that are meant to be clear and distinct or adequate to what they're talking about. Not necessarily visually observed things. They're not things. They're more like mental building blocks, because he's doing an inquiry into the understanding of the mind. But anyway, Jim Holt's sentence, why does the universe exist? Ignoring the problem of invocation of a noun with the, but he's talking about these ideas, universe, but also existence, which typically, I guess, are singular ideas. And in terms of question words and interrogation, universe seems to me to be a region. So I would categorize that as where, not mentioning, again, the fact that it's also singular as well. In light of that parsing or just simple analysis, we could argue that the question, why does the universe exist, is not so much whyful, but wherefore. So that's the power of a pretty straightforward analysis of nouns. And we're not even mentioning that the sentence, by invoking the verb exists, it refers to an idea of existence, which might be derived from a verb. And I guess that there are many ways to go down this, many ways to approach this exposition, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say that existence, of course, typically refers to, it seems to refer to the being of things. So it actually refers to the question of whether. Typically in theology, we're concerned whether or not a certain being, typically named God. Which one? Oh, dare you, don't you dare, because it's one, not plural. Whether or not God exists. So any reference to existence actually entails a reference to the category whether. So by this simple analysis, again, we're enriching Jim Holt. He gave a TED talk on this problem. Why does the universe exist? So we're also referring to whether it even does at all. And his straightforward question seems to imply or assume that whether universe exists or whether this singular term is relevant to us, to our community, our conscience, our shared prejudices, howsoever we are together with some common impulsive mind, that question is answered. That's just like law or God, and it's just kind of a reflex to ignore the plurality of regions and things, species, but to keep in your mind at all times the astronomical picture, which you picked up from encyclopedias, books, maybe documentaries, and so on. But whichever direction you look, whatever thing you think of, or look at rather, but to think of imagine this picture of solar system and galaxy and universe. Beyond that, always respect, first and foremost, the almost eternal astronomical phenomena, which are worth more than flesh and thought. Which is transient, but also very interesting as well, so it might be more relevant. And it depends on how you value it. Maybe a grasshopper on a brick is more valuable than a really big star. So yeah, the grasshopper, the insect, might be a higher order being. It's alive. Aren't beings that are alive more interesting than those, however big they are? Of course, you could say, well, the sun's supplying the solar energy, so. But however you want to, which is A more important than B or B more important than A, regardless of which conclusion you draw, you're discussing importance or value, which I suppose are again, relational ideas. But anyway, so Jim Holt's concept, universe, well, why does it exist? And if he were to say cause, that would imply a being that's the cause of the universe. Sounds theological again, but a cause is typically a why. So if we were to discuss some nouns and say easily what are their categories. Now an affirmation that the universe does exist. An affirmation that's of the category whether, because you could say yes or no. So same thing with the noun decision. You categorize that as whether, in wealth or abundance, how much, destination, not where, but whether, to remind ourselves of the richness of English syntax, where we have not a singular where that dominates whence and whether, but independent thinking, independent knowledge of whence and whether, not overwhelmed by repeated astronomical prejudice as a kind of spatial, visual starting point, nonverbal, of all arguments or chains of thought. One reinforces that grid, maybe looking at Earth from the moon or picturing the diagram of the solar system. It's called objectivity. You don't want to be subjective. That's just your thoughts or your opinions, but you're already looking at yourself as a being in what? In, dare I say, space. Maybe even Lord space, to attest to its overwhelming importance, but before even sentences can be crafted. Which goes back to why I wanted to expose the context of sentence generation with these tables of values of interrogative concepts. Now, the tool Well, that's typically how something is done. I put the nail in the wall with the hammer. More broadly, a method or a recipe. That's how. Procedure. That's how things are done. Now, an aardvark or a certain bird. These are species or genera of animals. So these are typically whatful things. What whatful have to do with taxonomy, typically visual species, but also shapes like circles, squares. Goes to what? Because we're talking about different kinds, sorts, which are as members of species, but also they are in contradistinction to others, whether other individuals or other species. Circle is similar to all other circles of its species, of course, but it's distinct from a square. So if we were to say that the criteria of existence of something is not only to be a member of a species, but to be distinguishable from others, then the universe does not exist in that strict Apollinian sense. Apollinian referring to Oswald Spengler's term for ancient Greek, somewhat Roman culture, fount of geometry, sculpture, tragedy, and so on. It's a kind of a whatful intellect. And of course, time, currents, moon, temporal concepts. So asking the question of when. Now, origin, source, ask the question of whence, just by their nounful being, not even involved in any sentences per se. And perhaps given a natural language parser, AI could be programmed to do this kind of response to sentences for us and tell us about our implicit interrogative constitution, that is, which categories we attest to be valuable and which others not so much, just given our scaffolding or girding terminology. So typically for a writer, not necessarily you and me, but terms like the world or knowledge of the world, it's so important, of course. But what is it besides a singular whereful fetish? Don't know, because shouldn't I value different places for different actions? We could have an office, we could have a store, we could have, a residence, a home. Different human activities occur in these places. That's a brief introduction, anyway, to and even stars like the sun. You could say a sun is a day, so a sun is actually a temporal concept. But if the sun is a star, then we're talking about it whatfully in terms of its species. Just looking through this table now, I think that's mostly sufficient. In some cases, you have to approach this metaphorically. I have to say person, who, but change of person, like metamorphosis, would also have to do with who, making a new who, especially through painting a self-portrait and seeing your prior person as a whole, and thus no longer being that being who to you now seems like a puppet or a subroutine that you understand its buttons, its ticks, and likewise. And not too much more to say, but numerically now, if I were to say the noun kiss, well, it's a reference to the idea of two. Just purely numerically, it implies a pair, a relation, a marriage. It's not just the two people, but also the contract that binds them, how they are together. like always with love. It's not a singular idea, I don't think, unless you consider love to be a singular, overwhelming motive for not just all human action, but all action whatsoever, and that this entire universe was laid out to be a habitat for man, destined to become a multiplanetary species, of course, a kind of overwhelming dominion. But other ideas like the entirety, if I were to say entirety, if I were to say whole, typically refer to oneness. Not typically, but just a bit tentatively speaking, for no reason in particular. An antithesis refers to the idea of two. Relation refers to two. So contracts, how two people are engaged, or how two institutions are engaged in business. They might have a contract. And what is that contract? Not a visible thing, like, I don't know, an apple or my hand, but it constrains their behavior. So what behaviors or events will happen? You could say, well, it's most likely that the two companies will abide by the contract. Same thing with two nations with a treaty. What's a treaty? Well, it's not visible like an ocean or a tree, so it doesn't really exist to me because I'm a materialist or whatever. But it might have more effect on actual motions or behaviors than the seeming mandatory constituents of these motions or behaviors. So the dilemma between materialism and spirituality is a false dilemma, because they're both attempts to say why things happen or why they don't happen, how they must happen. Materialist says, well, all things that happen are constrained by these materials at hand, so I can just think about them to know everything that's ever going to happen. It's determinism, right? And spirituality, of course, it's inventing fake reasons for things to happen. Maybe just because the materials. I don't know. So maybe materialism is enough. That's for the videos. That's for the guilt. It's going, right? You're stumbling, or okay, it's materialism. Fine, no problem. But I tend to prefer focus on motions or events, independent of alleged constituents or causes, whether it's matter or spirit. I don't really care. Whichever knowledge leads you to solving practical problems with respect to not just motions and physics, but what actions to take, what investments are you going to make towards your future. You could believe yourself compelled by angels to invest. Maybe you'd be mistaken, but if you made a good investment, then why not be deceived? And a lack, of course, might refer to idea of zero, if there is such a thing, numerically. You could even say light refers to the idea of two, if there's an implicit reference to darkness in that light. And proof, proof refers to premises, so there's also an idea of two, a relation, or simply speaking, scissors refers to idea of two. It could be, this numerical analysis can be pretty banal as well. A husband or a wife, of course, idea of two, going back to love, marriage. Maybe there's no love, it's just marriage, and likewise. But I think anyway that interrogative and numerical analysis of your own sentences is a way to analyze and expose what you value, maybe at the level of prejudgment. So you'd want to question that. So typically, numerically, value is expressed by making nouns singular that aren't in nature, such as the gods. But one expresses the greater value of one of these gods by making him the only one of a kind. And I guess likewise by big terms like reality. The reality is you have to do this, or I believe X, or I think that. It's a way to avert criticism. But reality is it's a reference to a realm, which is a reference to a law and certain how you should think and behave. For example, if our mutual friend Isaacson refers to Steve Jobs as reality distortion powers, it's really his power to evade common law or common prejudgments that are shared by the mass, the many, and so on. It's not so much, it's presented as fakeness, but it's more so following a higher law, and maybe independent. It's just achieving pure motion, pure future, independent of constraint.